Hello and welcome. We've got some big news to discuss this evening as Martin Truex Jr. has officially announced that 2024 will be his last full-time season in the NASCAR Cup Series. So go ahead and ease off the brakes because this is the Locke-Up. Earlier this week, it was announced by certain media members, namely Jeff Gluck and Bob Pockris, that Martin Truex Jr. was planning to decide soon on his plans for 2025, potentially as early as the end of the month. That was followed up later in the week with notice that there would be a press conference on Friday in Iowa, and that it was expected that Martin Truex Jr. would retire at the end of the season. This afternoon, that press conference did take place, and the rumors were correct. At the end of 2024, MTJ will vacate the Joe Gibbs Racing number 19 Toyota and end his tenure as the full-time Cup driver after 19 seasons. So what do we know at this point? Well, the phrasing of the announcement was that he would no longer be competing full-time in the Cup Series. This, of course, also means that there is now an opening at JGR for that seat. And Truex did say he's not leaving and that he'll be around. He looked at Joe Gibbs and said, we'll be doing some things together. And Joe did acknowledge that. So it does seem like he's not really just riding off into the sunset and that being the end of it. But that's really all we know for certain at this point. However, there's lots that we can surmise in relation to the announcement and lots of possibilities surrounding it that are open to looking at and evaluating. So let's do a little bit of that. That's one of the best parts of silly season after all. So let's start with Martin Truex Jr. himself. As we move forward, it's likely we'll see him running NASCAR races for the next while. I think he'll likely have a more increased role than Dale Jr., who only runs once a year, but I don't think we're going to see him running every second week, right? I wouldn't be surprised if he chases the Daytona 500 at least one more time, probably in the next year or so, obviously. Perhaps even driving for a team like 2311 if he wants to stay in the Toyota camp. Or maybe he'll be the next veteran that a team like Beard Motorsports goes after for their number 62 entry. I know that kind of seems like two really different possibilities, and I think that's okay. I think Martin Truex can do whatever he wants here. Long story short, he's used to top tier equipment, sure. But let's not forget, he's also been a big part of two teams that built themselves into contenders, namely Michael Waltrip Racing and Furniture Row. The second which, of course, Furniture Row, he took to a championship in 2014, along with Cole Pern. So I wouldn't be surprised about him deciding to do anything, really. He's kind of got the world wherever he wants to go. I'm sure the opportunity will present itself. Regardless of what he wants to do. I think one of the main components is going to be, is he going to enjoy it? I think that's what most of the opportunities that will come his way will boil down to. Am I, Martin Truex Jr., going to enjoy doing this? And I think if he looks at it and says, yeah, I think I'll enjoy doing that, then I think ink probably goes to paper. I think if not, chances are he probably walks past the opportunity. Doesn't need to prove anything, doesn't need to be here. So it is what it is. In that vein of things, I think it's likely he's going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. There's only a few scenarios I can think of where that doesn't work out. And most of them are related to having another driver on the ballot that is also what I would consider a first-time ballot Hall of Famer. And I really don't see that being an issue. For one, most guys that I would consider first ballot Hall of Famers that have already retired and are eligible are already in. And those that aren't, such as like a Kevin Harvick, for example, well, Kevin Harvick's going to be eligible before Martin Truex Jr., so that shouldn't be a conflict. That's really the only possible scenario I can see, depending on how much he races in the future in NASCAR and how that affects his eligibility. You never know. There could be something along the lines of him and Denny Hamlin happen to being on the same ballot or something along those lines, but I really think he's a first ballot Hall of Famer unless it's an absolute miserable set of circumstances that come in place, in which case I don't see there being a way that he gets past the second ballot. That's just where I'm at. Okay. So that's kind of what I see for Truex. Now, the next topic that's been close to everyone's mind is who's going to get in the number 19 next year as Martin Truex Jr.'s replacement. And we can get into names and we're gonna, but I want to take a step back from that because I think it's one thing that a lot of people are forgetting. I actually personally don't think there's a guarantee that we're going to see the number 19 on track next year. And that's not saying that I think JGR is getting rid of their fourth car. I really don't. I don't think anyone thinks that. However, if you look at the current numbers that are available in the Cup Series, the number 18 sticks out to me as an asset that Joe Gibbs may potentially have a strong affinity for still, for keeping in-house versus the number 19. Obviously, the number 18 left the stable at the end of 2022 when Kyle Busch left for Richard Childress Racing. And Joe Gibbs Racing, of course, opted to bring in Ty Gibbs, who had somewhat of a brand built with the number 54, and they opted to continue on with that number for whatever reason. They never really came out and said it, but I believe they have their reasons, of course. So at the time, switching the number 18 over to one of the other three drivers didn't make much sense. Denny Hamlin obviously was the 11. That brand is tied together very, very tightly. Martin Truex Jr. was in the 19. There was no reason to switch that. And of course, Christopher Bell, although he was newer onto the scene, where we could have seen a situation like Chase Elliott, who switched from the 24 to the 9 a couple of years into his career. The 20 also has a strong relationship for Joe Gibbs Racing, so it really didn't make much sense. However, with a new driver coming into the fold, I wouldn't be surprised, and truthfully, I expect to see Joe Gibbs Racing probably bring back the number 18. And I've got my reasons, okay? So when JGR first started back in 1992, Dale Jarrett was driving the number 18 for Joe Gibbs Racing. When Joe Gibbs Racing won their first Cup championship in 2000, Bobby Labonte, well, he was driving that number 18, okay, with that beautiful green interstate. But I digress. In 2007, when the opportunity came for Joe Gibbs to sign a young hotshot with a temper that just barely was overshadowed by his talent, he decided to put Kyle Busch in the number 18. And when Kyle Busch brought home 2 more championships for Joe Gibbs Racing in 2015 and 2019, it was in that number 18 car. That's not to say that the 19 car, it had its driving stints with great drivers, and it has its own magnitude as far as its history, right? We've got Martin Truex that has a fairly lengthy stint in that car. Daniel Suarez, nothing really much there other than the fact that, it diversified our field and allowed us to bring a Mexican driver into the Cup Series for the first time, but didn't really have much success. But then you also have a soon-to-be Hall of Famer, Carl Edwards, who also had a good amount of history in that car. So it does have a history all of its own and an important history. But the number 18 was the core of Joe Gibbs Racing. And the numbers, I will tell you, the numbers back it up. The number 18 was on the door for 80 of JGR's 213 wins so far, right? Now that's with 2 seasons off. So when the number 18 left the stable, that percentage would have been even higher, but that's a 38% win rating as it stands currently. Regardless of who gets in that seat, I personally hope to see the 18 on track and have that legacy continue. I mean, let's face it. Joe Gibbs Racing has 5 championships. 2 of those were from Kyle Busch. 1 of those was from Bobby Labonte. And the other 2 are the only 2 that came in car other than the number 18. And those were the 2 that Tony Stewart won in the 20 car. Long story short, the 18 has more history at Joe Gibbs Racing than any other number. And it deserves to be with JGR. Now, perhaps that's a little too passionate for most people about a car number, but I think it's important. But perhaps just as important is who's going to sit in that seat, regardless of what number is on it. So let's talk about that list of names that we mentioned earlier. According to Bob Pockrass, his sources are saying that Chase Briscoe is the front runner for that seat. And this makes a ton of sense. And it's easy to see why it'll probably be the case. With the retirement of Martin Truex Jr. coming at the end of the season, obviously, and Denny Hamlin likely not being that far behind, right? Denny Hamlin's now going to be the oldest driver in the field, I believe, other than Jimmy Johnson, who's part-time. It makes sense to me that you would want to have a veteran presence on that team going forward. Currently, I believe that role would obviously fall to Christopher Bell. He's getting to that point where he has the experience that you could call him a veteran, but we don't have any championship winners on this team once Martin leaves, right? So Christopher Bell may be approaching that spot, but given the opportunity to put another talented driver with a similar experience level in the seat, why wouldn't you? Since joining Stewart-Haas Racing in 2021, the team as a whole, SHR, okay, 4 cars, they've only won 4 races, 2 of which were Kevin Harvick, 1 of which was Eric Almirola, and the 4th one, well, that was Chase Briscoe. So he has some credibility in such a young career to have gotten a win with a team that was so underperforming, that only a Hall of Fame talent like Kevin Harvick, he only managed to double his win total. So I do think there's some credibility to that. I think it makes sense as to why that's going to happen. Most likely going to happen, I should say. I also think there's probably some money there from Mahindra and things of that nature. Now, I figure about 80% of the time when Bob says someone is a front runner for a seat, that's probably what's going to happen. However, I do want to spend a couple minutes going a little crazy and exploring some of the other options that I see possible within that 20%. Now, I'm not saying these are likely. I'm not saying I want them to happen. I'm not saying they're what I desire. They're just options that are theoretically on the table, okay? First guy I want to talk about is Noah Gragson. This one seems quite easy to me to make happen. Provided Toyota, which is kind of the link here that is maybe the missing element, provided they're willing to play ball with putting Gragson in a Toyota seat. With Bass Pro being a significant part of the number 19 sponsorship this season and in seasons past, it could be an easy transition financially to put in play. If this were to happen, I believe that this could be the main catalyst as to why JGR would retain the number 19 instead of reverting to the number 18. The reason I say that is Bass Pro has lots of merchandise out there that is associated with the number 19 already, so switching the number may not be a huge draw for them. However, they also sponsor Gragson in the 10 and Austin Dillon in the number 3. They sponsor Gragson in the Xfinity in the number 9. So they may not care about the number at all. But that's just one reason why I could see them retaining that number 19. I also see that Gragson has improved quite a bit this year over last year in the Cup Series. Obviously, that was a series. That was a situation where he was not in good equipment and was not in a good situation for him. Kind of a lame duck season there with Legacy MC switching from Chevy to Toyota and announcing it early in the season. But I digress. Noah Gragson is the guy that I see that could potentially sneak in there and also take that seat. Another guy that I think is maybe being a little bit overlooked here is John Hunter Nemechek. Now, Nemechek ran full-time in the Cup Series back in 2020 with Front Row Motorsports before deciding he wanted to go back through the ranks and basically gamble on himself, that he could improve his stock, that he could kind of increase through the ranks and become a top-tier prospect instead of, a journeyman or whatever he was going to accomplish at that current spot. And truthfully, in many ways, he has done just that. Nemechek is back in the Cup Series, this time with Legacy MC, which just happens to be Toyota affiliated. I probably don't have to tell you that. Although he hasn't won a championship in the NASCAR ranks, whether Cup, Trucks, or Xfinity, he has finished 3rd and 4th in the Truck Series throughout that time frame, and he's won a pile of races. He's obviously got talent and skill, so I wouldn't be surprised if we see that transpire. I don't know the relationship that JGR and Legacy MC have. I actually think that not having a relationship probably is better for Nemechek's odds of getting that ride, just because you don't bite the mouth that you don't bite the hand that feeds you, and likewise, if you're the hand feeding, you don't stick it in the horse's mouth and give them the opportunity. So you might not want to sever that relationship. However, if that relationship isn't really there, if Toyota wants him in better equipment, then that's probably what will happen. Now, the third option that I'm going to talk about, there is more options, obviously, but I'm just trying to pick a couple of the more crazy ones that could happen. I think Nemechek is probably the most likely of the three I'm going to give you as far as what people look at as, JGR material. But this third one is interesting to me because I've seen people kind of surmising about it and speculating about it. But Kyle Busch, this has to be one of the more interesting speculations that I've heard going around. And I really don't give a lot of credibility to it. But it's interesting. It's fun to consider. Let's go with fun. Okay. Now, Richard Childress Racing has the option on Kyle Busch for a third season, 23, 24, and then the option for 2025. However, If you remember back, the same could have been said about Tyler Reddick when 23XI announced that they had signed him for the 24 season back in 2022. It was a year and a half before the season began. Now, somewhere along the line, Richard Childress was willing to let Tyler Reddick go out of that contract and didn't force him to stay for the option. Okay. Now, perhaps he was persuaded, by money, a little bit of financial input, whatever, or perhaps there was something else. But if there's any substance to this rumor at all, it would all hinge on Childress being willing to part with one of the greatest talents in NASCAR history. So all of that's irrelevant, other than the fact that something persuaded him to do it. And so it all hinges on, is he willing to do it again? Having said all of that, if you had both Kyle Busch and the number 8 team returning to JGR on your 2024 silly season bingo card, theoretically, you could be onto something. You know, if you're looking for that feel-good story, I guess, having Kyle Busch go back to Joe Gibbs Racing, where he had so much success, and return to that number 18 car, that would be pretty stellar. Now, I don't know if that relationship is beyond repair between him and Joe Gibbs. I don't know if the sponsorship could be put in place to pull that off. You know, I don't know about any of that, which is why I think I doubt so much that there's any real credibility to it, because it doesn't really make sense. It's very rare that we ever see a driver leave a team and then go back, especially such a short time frame. I mean, it's only been 2 seasons. And I think in this situation, Kyle Busch probably needs JGR more than JGR needs Kyle Busch, right? Because JGR is still a top-tier team. Kyle Busch, although a top-tier talent, he needs equipment right now that he doesn't have. So that's the element that I think would be interesting. At the end of the day, really all comes down to this. Congratulations to Martin Truex Jr. on a storied career. So far, he's accumulated 35 wins and a championship, with the potential to increase both of those as the season moves on. Looking back, it is easy to wonder how many more wins or even championships Martin could have accumulated had he ever had great equipment before 2016. But that partnership between he and Cole Pearn during the mid-2010s was one of the greatest pairings NASCAR has ever seen. And for Martin Truex Jr., it's been a great career, and one that many fans are going to miss. Thank you so much for tuning into the original episode of The Locke-Up. This series has no specific schedule and will only be created when there are topics that have occurred after we record it before the green, but I'm really looking forward to sharing this time with you all. If you like this content, please make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We'll see you next time.